welcome to Stories for Wonderful Children. I'm Dan Wendelin, your host and storyteller. For many years, I improvised a new bedtime story for my children every night. Now, with their permission, I'm sharing the recordings of the best of those stories with you. Right now, we're about halfway through a long story that I told during the pandemic lockdown of 2020 about a girl who attends an online school for adventuring named Myra. I hope that you enjoy it as much as we did. The next 2 days passed strangely. Myra started each of them the same way, sitting up in bed and immediately looking down at Tweety's sand mattress, hoping to see Tweety sleeping there. But Tweety did not return the next day, nor the day after that. Myra kept busy with classwork and also with telling anyone who would listen that there was a student missing in the forest. She told campus security. She told Professor Tad. Kisa and Kevin and a couple of Akisa's other friends had come that first evening back out of the forest, reporting that they had searched everywhere in the area near the school, and that there was no sign of Tweety. There were no tracks. There was no pan that had held the cinnamon rolls. There were no loose bits of rock lying around that looked like they might have once been part of Tweety. Tweety was simply gone, disappeared into thin air. Kisa did report one other strange thing. She said, "You know, Myra, the other weird thing? No deer. Usually when we go through this part of the forest, we see a few deer, but there were none. Not a single one. That seemed strange." "Yeah," said Myra. "Strange." So she concentrated as best she could on resisting the temptation to go into the woods herself, figuring that if Kisa and Kevin in the third years had been unable to find Tweety, there was really not much reason to expect that she would be able to find Tweety. She focused on her classes and focused on being ready for Parents' Weekend. And so it was, the morning of the third day, that she and Kisa were standing together near the gates of the online school, watching the streams of parents arrive through the gates. Myra was deeply nervous, excited, looking forward to seeing her parents, but also still feeling a little trepidation about whether her parents were really as content with her studying to be a sneaker as they had indicated in their letters. But moments later, Kisa pointed and said, "There they are." And Myra and Kisa made their way through the crowds of arriving parents. And Myra felt herself swept up in her parents' hug as they hugged both she and Kisa at the same time and said, "Oh, our wonderful daughters, it is so good to see you." Her father held her at arm's length and said, "Let me take a look at you." He said, "You don't look any sneakier to me." Myra tried to smile, but she wasn't really sure how to take that. Her mother, though, poked her father in the ribs and said, "Of course she doesn't look sneaky. That's what makes them sneakers, right? If they looked sneaky, everyone would pay attention to them." "Sure," said Myra. "So, I'm so glad to see you all. The first thing for Parents' Weekend is that Kisa and I are supposed to each take you to one of our classes with us. So since there are two of us and two of you, we weren't really sure which of you would like to go to fighter classes with Kisa and which of you would like to go to see sneaker class with me." Her mom smiled. "We've talked about it," she said, "actually. We already talked about it with Kisa. We've already seen all the fighter classes up close and personal, and we've seen Kisa's fighter classes the last 2 years at Parents' Weekend. We'd like to both see what happens in a sneaker class. Myra looked over at Kisa. Is that okay? She said. Kisa said, yeah, it's perfectly fine. Absolutely. They've been with me the last 2 years. Go show them your sneaker stuff. We'll see you for lunch. So Myra led them across campus to the sneaker building. She found Professor Tad waiting for them along with Antoine and Chelsea and their parents. And everyone was introduced all around. And then Professor Tad said, well, I thought that today we would show you what your children have been learning. So if you'll follow me down to the practice dungeon. And he led them all down to the basement of the sneaker building and then down the stairs from the basement until they arrived on the level with the torches and all the stone walls. And he said, all right, parents, if you'll come with me, I'll take you to the observation area. Students, I'd like you to run the obstacle course. Now, Myra and Chelsea and Antoine had run the obstacle course a bunch of times, but that was not to say that they knew what to expect, because other than the entrance and the exit, what was between was different every time. Myra briefly remembered her first time in the obstacle course when she had to encounter a minotaur. She didn't figure they would probably be bringing the minotaur out for Parents' Weekend, but you never knew. So she and Antoine and Chelsea stepped up to the entrance. There was on the door a lock. Myra stepped forward and carefully examined it and looked back at Antoine and Chelsea. She sneaker-signed, "It's trapped." They examined it closely, and then Antoine held the wire that triggered the trap in place, while Chelsea snipped it, and then they tied it off so that it wouldn't move. And then Myra picked the lock, and they swung the doors wide and stepped in and stopped. What was usually a maze, or at least a series of doors, was all missing. The obstacle course was just one enormous cavern. Myra could spot, when she looked carefully, the little eye slit up near the top where observers were. But her attention was really drawn by the occupant. The cavern was empty except for treasure piled all the way up, almost to the ceiling in the middle, and curled around it was an enormous dragon, apparently sound asleep. The dragon was literally lying around the treasure. It was so large that it occupied much of the room, and to get past it, or to get around it, they were going to have to come very close to it. Myra looked over at Antoine and Chelsea, who both just shrugged. Myra thought to herself, well, can't possibly be any worse than sneaking up on a string demon, right? She finger-signed to them to take a look around, and so they very quietly slid along the walls from shadow to shadow. Myra was keeping an eye on the dragon, and as she did, she saw it. Buried in the treasure were 3 flags that she knew very well. Whenever they ran the obstacle course, there was always a flag with your name on it. Sometimes it was protected by a trap, sometimes it was hidden in a locked chest or a secret panel, but you had to find the flag before you got out. The flags were in the middle of the pile of treasure. So they would have to climb up all that clinky metal over a dragon and then get past the dragon to get out the other side. She met Antoine and Chelsea back, and sneaker signed with her fingers to tell them where the flags were and to ask whether they had any ideas. Antoine signed, maybe one of us could distract the dragon while the other two get the flags. I'm not sure getting one of us eaten in front of our parents is really the best plan, Chelsea's sneaker spoke back. Myra thought about it for a minute. There must be a way around this, she thought. She looked around again. She pointed. The walls sported something new. Handholds, if you looked for them. Not really handholds, but rough spots that weren't really there. And then she followed the handholds up to the ceiling and saw that the roof also had places where someone with strong arms and good climbing skills could make their way across the ceiling. But then she thought, how to get the flags? She finger signed to them, spread out, look for a rope. And so they made their way around the room, and when they met on the other side, Chelsea was holding a coil of black silken rope. She signed that it had been hidden in a particularly dark corner, and she would not have seen it if she had not pretty much stepped on it. Myra led them back to the handholds, and together they scaled up and across the ceiling until they were hanging above the flags. And then they found some rocks in the ceiling that they were able to help secure the rope. The other two held while Myra made her way down the rope, plucked the flags, and then scaled back to the ceiling. They made their way back to the handholds and to the door. Myra looked at it. No trap that she could see. No lock. She took the flag in her hand, handed the other two to Antoine and Chelsea, and they pulled, and the doors opened with a squeak, and they heard a whoosh of the dragon snorting and beginning to raise its head. Looking at each other, they quickly darted through the doors and pulled them closed behind them. Professor Tad and their parents were standing there. Professor Tad gave them a smile and a nod of approval as he accepted their flags back. So, he said, that's what your students have been learning. Any questions? Myra's mother raised her hand. She said, what would happen if they had woken the dragon? Professor Tad said, they would have scored poorly on their evaluation. But no one's ever been eaten as part of the quiz, right? Professor Tad smiled. Very rarely, he said. Actually, this dragon works on contract for the school, and no students would have been harmed. Good, said Myra's mother. I mean, I'm all in favor of learning to fight dragons, but not before third year, right? Professor Tad said, don't worry. We take good care of your student. All right, he said. So, that was the demonstration, and you all can head off to lunch. So Myra led her parents toward the cafeteria to meet up with Kisa for lunch. That is the end for tonight. Thanks for listening to Stories for Wonderful Children. I created today's show, but questions and commentary were supplied by my children. The theme music was written by Brandon Thompson, and our wonderful logo was designed by Silas Wendelin. If you're enjoying the show, please tell someone about it, and leave a review with your podcast provider. You can now subscribe to the show to get extra stories and longer chapters of Myra and the Online School that combine multiple segments into a longer episode. The show's website is storiesforwonderfulchildren.buzzsprout.com. Until next time, I'm Dan Wendelin, reminding you to tell someone you love a story.